We're going to take a historical look at news coverage relating to geese in both American and European news outlets. So prior to 2009, goose coverage generally tended to fall into one of three categories. Either hunting, both for sport and for culling. A sports story might be something, for instance, announcing the start of a hunting season. Nuisance stories, which are more prevalent in the last 15 to 20 years. These are stories about geese fouling city parks and golf courses. And then air accidents. Stories about air accidents are primarily military, principally because they are typically more expensive or more costly in terms of lives. So these graphs show, they're essentially the same graph. The lower graph spreads out data farther on 20 years. The first graph shows a generally flat distribution of stories returned with the search term geese. The search term goose was not used because you get a huge spike in stories of the spruce goose, which foul the results. So there is a trend up in the 1980s about coverage of geese, but it's not intense. Below that is a similar graph that also shows the last 20 years since 1980, and it shows the serious spike in coverage of geese in stories. This can also be seen if you add modifier terms to geese, like disease or crash. Geese and disease stories peaked in 2005 when the avian flu was a serious topic of debate both in the news and other media outlets. And then also crash, which seems to have peaked in 1995. This is surrounding a crash of an Air Force AWAC aircraft when it hit a flock of geese. You can also see in the very far right of that same lower graph a spike surrounding what we assume to be coverage of the aircraft crash into the Hudson in 2009. This is a blow-up of the search term geese as returned in Google News, starting in September 2008 on the left, moving to the end of November 2009 this year. And you can see an obvious spike in January of 2009. That's when the Hudson landing occurred. Google returns a total of over 1,000 articles just in that month, just from the sources that it crawls. So in the last 3 months, coverage has generally returned to average, with still an elevated number of stories related to geese if you measure it across, say, 60 years, but those stories are within the average of the last, say, 20 years. Also within that sort of elevated average coverage, there may be something related to goose protection laws that were put into place in the 1980s, and an uptick in that coverage may have something to do with overall those laws being effective and there being more and more Canadian geese available, or not available, but available to cause news stories. So major shift that we see today versus before is that increasingly you have circular commentary with pundits and 24-hour news networks amplifying this coverage. And then it all comes full circle nowadays with satirists taking over and showing that these news coverage issues, especially something that seems as silly as geese, can be taken too far or too seriously and become something that becomes a subject of satire.
Katie Couric is off today,
but I'm still looking at a fine shot.
I'm Maggie Rodriguez.
Nice to meet you, boo. Let's talk about the news.
The city of New York is declaring a war on geese, and some animal activists are crying,
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 crying foul,
crying how?
crying foul.
Oh.
Birds can become a feather fall if they collide with airplanes. Operation Goose Be Gone involves reducing their population within 5 miles of the airport.
Oh, those geese are cooked. Those geese are cooked.
Wildlife experts and the FAA concur.
Those geese are cooked. The Federal Commission of Me agrees.
Those geese are cooked.
Now they're living on a wing and a prayer, a wing and a prayer. How many geese?
2,000 geese.
That's a lot of geese.
Those geese are
So fat and so tasty for my helpers flying homies.
The debate continues in New York, but for now, those geese are cooked.